All right. Hello, neighbors. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program and welcome. My name is Danielle, and I'm an adult services librarian here. Tonight's program was inspired in part by our annual summer reading program. We selected Kindness and Wonder, Why Mr. Rogers Matters Now More Than Ever by author Gavin Edwards to be our community read for the summer. Whether you're here because you read the book with us, are a Mr. Rogers fan, or simply think the world could use a little more kindness and wonder, we thank you for being here tonight with us. And now I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight's Meet the Author program. Gavin Edwards is the New York Times bestselling author of 9 books, including MCU, The Reign of Marvel Studios, The Tao of Bill Murray, and Last Night at the Viper Room. A longtime contributor to Rolling Stone, he has written for the New York Times, Wired, Billboard, and GQ, and appeared on television programs including Today, Entertainment Tonight, and Jeopardy, which is a favorite of ours. He's also moonlighted as a game designer, photographer, and demolition derby driver. He lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, so he's all the way from North Carolina this evening. So please help me in welcoming Gavin. Thank you, everyone.
Danielle, thank you, and thank you all for being here. And I'm so honored to be here. I am so honored that the book was picked as a community read. And this is just like a really, I don't live here, but I just walked around the library, and this is a magical place. And I hope you guys know how lucky you are to have a library like this. It's really extraordinary. So thank you all for being here. I'm especially glad. I wrote this book 5 years ago. And I've written, I think it's actually 14 books now, but this one is really dear to my heart. And of all the books I've done, it's the one, there have been some that have been more fun to do. There have been some that sort of have sold better, but this is the one that actually changed me the most as I did it, and had the most impact in my life. So I want to talk to you tonight about, somewhat about Fred Rogers, then also about the process of how I put together the book and what it is. Then if you, at the end, you can ask me about anything you want. If you want to ask about Fred Rogers, if you want to ask about writing, if you want to ask about, I've got other writing gigs that include, I write obituaries for the New York Times, and I've done books about Bill Murray and Tom Hanks, and so lay it all on me. I'm here for it. Let me start by welcoming the world of Fred Rogers. So one of the things he always did, he had you don't just zip it up, but you zip it up a little and then you bring it back down again. And a lot of the, it was wonderful as I was researching the book to find out how so many of the rituals came from things that years of experience, changing into his sneakers was because when he was a puppeteer, he would always be running around in the back of the stage, and he discovered that if he had hard-soled shoes, that he would be loud. So part of being ready for the show was putting on his sneakers. One of the things that was most astonishing to me was if you, in your mind's eye, you see Fred Rogers comes in, he's saying it's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, and he's moving to your right. And in fact, when I was in Pittsburgh and I saw some of the sets and the props from the show, there's a staircase he could have gone left, but he never ever went left because he's always going right. It's because he wants the consistency for the children who are watching the show. He wants the consistency for himself. When he finds something that works, he likes to keep doing it the same way. And he also thought that if he tried to stage the action moving from left to right as much as possible on the show, it would help children as they learn to read. So even simple decisions like that, there was actually a deep architecture behind it. So let's let Mr. Rogers welcome us. Then we'll talk about him a little more. So Fred Rogers had an astonishing number of talents. I mean, he was a writer, he was an editor. He liked to say that he was only accidentally a performer. He was also a pilot, he was a photographer, he was a puppeteer. He was obviously a musician. And so one of the amazing things to me as I did this book was finding that he, like managed to find a job that did almost everything to use all of his gifts, except for maybe the being a pilot and the being a photographer. But sort of the fact that he found these ways of synthesizing that, and then his, he's an ordained minister, he's a trained child psychologist, and my favorite description of him from anybody was a woman who the first time she saw him and said, "Oh, I get it, he's a singing psychologist for children." So it's really just sort of this remarkable act of genius on his part that when television was still a primitive thing with maybe 1 or 2 channels, he saw this and said, I can do something with this. And then through repetition and through love, that he was able to keep doing it over and over in a way that, for me at least, was a real solace when I was growing up. Let me ask some questions. So how many of people in the room watched Mr. Rogers when they were younger? All right. And I promise I won't be offended if the answer is no. How many of you have read my book? Okay, so it's a mix. I know I'll be repeating a few things from it, but we'll also hopefully talk about other things. One of my favorite biographical details is that he had the same piano his entire life. And when he was a child, his grandmother told him that, he sort of lobbied her, I'm getting serious about music. I really think I should have a piano where I can play piano and write songs. And she said, okay, Freddie, if you go to the Steinway showroom and pick out a piano, I will pay for it. And he goes, he takes the streetcar in Pittsburgh to the Steinway showroom. He's about 10 years old. And they let him try every piano, and he picks the grand Steinway concert piano, the best one that they have. And they basically say, okay, kid, get out of it, you can't afford that. But he, he knew what he liked. And his grandmother was like, well, a deal's a deal, and writes, a very large check so that he could do that. And that's the piano he had for the rest of his life. And every single song that he ever wrote was on that piano, including It's You I Like. So I sometimes, when I write a book, there's some of them that is something that I came up with and I try to sell people on. And then there's other times when somebody comes to me. There was a book I wrote some years ago about the actor River Phoenix, which was a real labor of love. But I did it, and I discovered after it came out, I'm like, oh, I can't convince people to love River Phoenix if they never cared about him in the first place. And so I realized that if I'm going to spend a year of my time or more working on a book, I have this Venn diagram in my head, and it's things I like, things other people like. So I need to be in the middle. And so it's I'm always looking for the thing that feels right with that. And if it's like Bill Murray, then great, I love what he does. I know other people do as well. And then it's a gift if a publisher comes to me, and this happened in this case, and said, would you like to do a book on Fred Rogers? And I took maybe 20 minutes to think about it because that wasn't how I had been planning on spending the next 8 months. But the answer was, of course. And I didn't even realize how great that was going to end up being. It took about 8 months to do the book, which is a little faster than I usually take a year. But as I came in, I always think of my college roommate, James Hanahan. And here's one of his books here that I found as I came in. He takes about 5 years. And we had a conversation about this once where we just sort of gazed at each other uncomprehendingly. That, it was such different geological timescales of how do you do a book. But For me, I love the idea of like really deeply immersing myself in it and doing as much research as I can, and then at a certain point I draw a line in the sand and say it's time to write. And in a case like this, where I have to write it fairly quickly, it means I have to be very structured and organized about it. It's not a moment when I can sort of say, well, I'll try going in this direction, let's see what happens. I once interviewed George R. R. Martin, who wrote the Game of Thrones books. And he said this wonderful thing that I've always held with me, which is that there's two types of writers, and there's architects and there's gardeners. And you see where this is going. And so there's some who like to, sort of like have everything laid out ahead of time and say, like, if I'm going to write the sentence, I want to know exactly where it's going to fit. And I'm basically an architect. He is basically a gardener, which is, sort of like, how you hope the garden's going to turn out. You're going to plant some things, and then you're going to prune it, and maybe you'll move it. And that has like the joy of discovery and improvisation as you go along, as witnessed by the fact that it's taken about 10 years since the last book. You can also get stuck. So it's got its pros and its cons. Whenever I can, if I'm writing a biography of somebody, like the obvious first thing you want to do is, can I talk to this person? Sort of like, okay, I can get in a hotel room with Bill Murray, I've got a cornerstone. Like, that's the beginning of the book. Occasionally, it doesn't work out. I did a book on Tom Hanks where I sort of like, he loves typewriters. I found a typewriter. I wrote him a letter saying, could I please sit down and spend some time with you? And I got back this amazingly passive-aggressive typewritten letter where it was like, but it was so charming, I couldn't be mad. So he was said like, oh, I could give you some time like a year and a half from now. So he was like saying yes, but in the least helpful way possible. But it was such like a delightful like typewritten letter from Tom Hanks. I'm like, oh, all right, I still really like you. So obviously in this case, Fred Rogers was no longer alive when I did the book. And I really regretted when I was a much younger man, I was working at a Details magazine. And I one day got a phone call from the publicist for Fred Rogers saying like, hey, would you guys be interested in interviewing him? Which at the time seemed totally off the beam, and I'm like, we don't, sort of, it doesn't fit into our usual mix of, sort of like grunge rock stars, and but he's an interesting guy. What if we did a Backpage interview? And I sent a couple of examples of Backpage interviews we had done, but it was with people like sort of Steven Tyler of Aerosmith, and they're like, it's a little too racy for us. And that publicist, by the way, is the actor David Newell, who played Mr. McFeely on the show. So one of the great things about, sort of like the Fred Rogers enterprise is that like it is a family environment, and everyone did like 2 or 3 jobs at once. So given that Fred Rogers was not available to me, I did the thing you always need to do when you start a project, which is you go to the library. And so some of my books, sort of like, you can start off with like a big research library and see if people still carry the periodic guide to the Reader's Guide to Periodic Literature, which sometimes they have to like pull the volumes out of the basement, but they do still exist. I've often, for a book on somebody like, say, Samuel L. Jackson, the Academy in Los Angeles has the Margaret Herrick Library, which is one of the best showbiz libraries in the United States. In this case, I drove up to Latrobe, Pennsylvania, the Fred Rogers' hometown, and the Fred Rogers Center. Please come in, join us. And the Fred Rogers Center has just like an amazing amount of archives, and there was some stuff that like was still under lock and key there, but I could ask, could I have examples of his speeches? Could I have examples of his letters? And the librarian would just sort of like bring this like, like once an hour or so, like another folder of amazing material would come in. And there were these heartfelt letters where like there would be, sort of somebody who had had a summer internship with Fred Rogers and was writing and telling him like how it changed his life and how much it meant to him. There was correspondence back and forth with a man whose daughter had died tragically young in a car accident, and like seeing how they were like both responding to each other and like the solace that Mr. Rogers was able to offer. There was like tickets for like the clothes he had worn on a particular show, so like they kept track of like what color the sweater was for any given episode. There was these wonderful, there was original scripts, and he had this very precise but looping handwriting, and he like modified things with such care that sort of like the scripts of shows that like could seem like sort of slight and effervescent like on the air, you could see every single word was precisely chosen. My single favorite word in all of this was there was a letter that he wrote to the sort of staff saying like okay, sort of like this is what we're gearing up to do next year, and this is the things we did this past year. It was his year-end letter, and it ended with a PS from King Friday the 13th, and the word was Slopery doza fenunda puck, which to me sounds like it's like a Parliament Funkadelic record that never came out, or maybe like an Outkast album. And I just love the, sort of like that sense of like wordplay and whimsy, and that like infused like so much of what Fred Rogers did. The other thing I did at that point was I called my friend Morgan Neville, who had done a really wonderful documentary on Fred Rogers, and just sort of like said, hey, I'm going to do this. I want your blessing. I don't want you to feel like I'm ripping you off. And he said, by all means. And we talked about, there was two big takeaways from that conversation for me. And one was that he was like, oh, you're doing Fred. I'm like, Fred, he's Mr. Rogers. Like, and it took me a while to get used to thinking of him as Fred. But like the way that helped me was that he wanted his friends to call him Fred. And he thought of every single person in this room as a friend. And like he really would have been fine with that. And the other thing Morgan told me was that when he first got access to the like Fred Rogers archives, they said, well, what would you like to see? And he said, I want to see the show he did when RFK was assassinated, which at the time had not been available in a long time. And it is just so heartrending. I don't know how many of you've seen it, but so he had not been doing the show for very long. I mean, there was different versions of it, but like the version of it in the United States called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood had only been on the air for like a year or two. And there had been, sort of like a spate of horrible deaths, and he was so concerned. It was not a traditional, sort of presentation of here we are in the neighborhood in the trolley. It was a special he did in the evening talking to parents about how do you talk to your children about these things. And he's so clearly nervous. He's like touching the wall, he's wringing his hands, there's like a plant, he's touching it, that like he is not composed the way that he normally is. And he really wants to get this across. And one of the things, sort of he had not yet come up with the phrase that he often used, which was whenever there's like terrible things on television or disasters, look for the helpers. If you see like a fire or something on TV, there's going to be people there who are going to go help. But what he did talk about, which was just that, sort of tell your children what's going on, like answer their questions. They probably know more than you do, but like, if it's mentionable, then it's manageable. And if you can talk about it, then they will be able to do it. And he had this metaphor for, sort of it was Daniel Tiger and Lady Aberlin, and just sort of like inflating a balloon and then like letting the air out. And it just like always and the suddenness of which like the balloon could be deflated and there was no longer like air or life. And it was a simple metaphor that like still chokes me up. And this was his gift, that he was able to find, sort of like ways of explaining sort of like big concepts to children that way they could get their head around. So, I I go home from Latrobe, Pennsylvania. I stop at Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water on the way, and I call up as many people as I can find who appeared on the show. And so I talked to Lynn Swan, the Football Hall of Famer. I talked to Bill Nye, the science guy, who was just thrilled that he'd gotten to be on the show and watch how Fred Rogers does it. I spoke to a national treasure, Rita Moreno, who was on the show, and I want to show you her on the show. So I had interviewed her once briefly before about Aretha Franklin because she was performing at the Kennedy Center Honors on the night where Rita Moreno also won it. And so I sort of request via her publicist, and I'm thinking she's not going to want to do this, but she was so excited to get on the phone with me because that visit had meant a lot to her. She had shown up with her husband and her daughter, and the interview, Mr. Rogers mostly interviewed her husband, who was a doctor, and it was going through the black bag of okay, what's a stethoscope? How do you use it? What does that mean? And they brought her their daughter, who was about 6 years old and was a big fan, but was also very, very shy. And so she spent the whole time clinging to Rita's leg and sort of burrowing into her because it was all very intimidating. And at the end, Fred got her to feed the fish, and and then off the family goes. And the thing that had just sort of meant so much to Rita and that she knew was not planned was that he then looked into the camera and said, "Did you see how their daughter was very shy? And did you see how much they loved her anyway?" And just the fact that he was sensitive to the emotions in that moment, she remembered being watching episodes of the Tonight Show where people had made fun of Fred Rogers, and she was still indignant on his behalf decades later that this guy is so much of a better human being than you are. So I also, one of my favorite interviews was with Nick Tallow, who is sort of the bearded, the long hair and tattoo. He was the floor manager for the neighborhood who looked as if he was in a motorcycle gang. And it was, I had a friend who's oh, I sort of there was all these stories of practical jokes and that he plays where, sort of they put sort of a doll in the closet as he opens it and surprise Fred. Or there was once where it was actually Nick himself naked and Fred opens it. And Nick got very upset when I asked about this. He's nobody was supposed to know about this, and it's Michael Keaton who told everybody, who was a production assistant on the show as a young man, and what is he doing running his mouth? But I just love that, sort of the love that they all had for each other. That he's like Freddie didn't know how to use a screwdriver. He was technically incompetent, and but that sort of that he couldn't believe that he knew that if he was feeling down and out that he would get a phone call from Fred that night. And that when Fred was performing, he would Nick would be there right beside the camera, just looking encouragingly at him, making sure that he was feeling the love coming in return. And the connection that they had that way, I don't know, it means the world to me. So I then, sort of when I had enough material, I knew that I wanted to. So the type of books I've written, a lot of them are biographies of people, but what makes them interesting to me is finding a way to have a point of entry, so it's not just the blow by blow. Here are the facts of year by year, and then in 1973 he did this. So why do we care about this person? So when I did the book, The Tao of Bill Murray, okay, he's been in a lot of movies, but the thing that you really care about is Bill Murray shows up at your party, uninvited, he washes the dishes and he leaves. And so collecting those stories and making a case for he's not just being antic, he's secretly teaching us all how to live. When I wrote a book about Samuel Jackson, sort of his life is in his work, but then I was able to, so there wasn't like full of like the same like set of anecdotes, but saying the fact that he embodies sort of like a modern sense of cool. And once I was able to like kick off the book with, once I said, if I start with a like analysis of what cool is in the 21st century, and to what extent is that racially coded, and what does it mean? Is it like, is it a defunct value? Then I've got like a book that's like worth writing, it's interesting to me. And with Fred, it was, he was telling you what he cared about. And so I distilled it into 10 messages, and I'm just gonna quickly read them. Be deep and simple, be kind to strangers, make a joyful noise, tell the truth, connect with other people every way you can, love your neighbors, find the light in the darkness, always see the very best in other people, accept the changing seasons, and share what you've learned all your life. And some of these were reverse engineered. I knew I wanted to write about like the crazy set of like overlapping similarities between like Fred Rogers and Andy Warhol and George Romero, the zombie movie director, who all were in this like Pittsburgh, New York access together. And in the case of George, like, and Andy Warhol's the brother like worked on the show, as did George Romero, like making, before he made zombie movies, he would make short films for the neighborhood. But the one that kept coming back to was like, be deep and simple. So I work at a school down in North Carolina. I'm not a teacher, I'm the editorial director. And we recently read the David Brooks book, How to Know a Person. And like, we were in discussion groups about it, and I was saying it's not a very complicated philosophy that he's laying out here. It's basically just try to talk to other people and make them feel at home and feel like they are seen by you. And similarly, like, Fred Rogers' philosophy is not complicated, but it's so deep and affirming. And when I wrote this book, as I was doing it, I just sort of like said, if I'm not going to be Fred Rogers, despite the fact that I own a cardigan, but if I can be even like 5% more like Fred Rogers, and if like my book can get people to be like 2% more like Fred Rogers, then like the world is going to be a better place. And so, like, and I'm not here to tell you what to do, but I can say that, for me at least, like the things I gave up, which is like being sarcastic on the internet, is like not things I miss, and like the effort to see the best in other people, to be kind to other people, to make a connection that, like Fred Rogers, he was a more religious man than I, and so the way he thought about this is like when he's looking into the camera, he has this connection, and he thinks like that's where the Holy Ghost is. That sort of like there is an ineffable, like you're touched by grace, and this is why it's worth doing what he does. Well, I'm going to. I will tell you just a few other things about the process of writing, and then I want to make sure I have time to answer questions. So one of the things that happens when I write is, if I can, I like to just sort of like go away and isolate myself for a while. Like a friend of mine was kind enough to like loan me like a beach cottage, and I never like saw the shore. I was just like locked in the house, but I reached this like ecstatic state of like, I know where everything is. That, like if I'm writing, like I know like the perfect quote, and I read it in like, sort of like that Fred Rogers book that he wrote there, or was in that documentary, and just like, I feel like plugged into whatever story it is that I'm trying to tell. And when I wrote, I think like a third of the book in the space of a week or so. And then I come home and I collapse, and it takes me like a while to recover from that. But when I can, the joy of writing a book for me is that like, just if I can write like 14 hours a day and be completely zeroed into it, then like it's working, and it's going to be what I want it to be. I am almost like superstitious about, sort of I've got the structure, but if I have an opening I will plow through the structure like with dispatch, except I always get stuck on the opening sentence. And once I have that, I can start. And in this case, sort of like I came to it and it was, Fred Rogers entered the world with a serious disadvantage, albeit a typical one. He was born a child. And I knew like I would be able to go forward from there. And then, sort of like knowing that like, okay, where do I put like all the different like sort of like human quirks, the fact that he liked for breakfast to heat up cranberry juice, which seems disgusting to me, but like clearly worked for him. Sort of like finding the perfect place for the story about when like he bought a used car and he knew that like I'm sure he's going to offer me a fair price, and of course nobody is going to cheat Mr. Rogers. So, and then sort of like the art of it is finding. It's like wanting to do honor to him by finding the stories about him that like communicate the messages about like why he had the impact that he did. I'm going to play you one more clip of Mr. Rogers because it was one of the very best stories. This one is from my friend Morgan's movie because it was the best place to get the underlying source. So there'll be a couple of other things there. So, like, he inspires so much, and that, like, I came in knowing that there was, like, as I mentioned, like, many books and movies and documentaries and even, like, websites, like, tracking, like, like the colors of, like, which sweaters he had worn on which days. And so I was just hoping that, like, I would find, like, a way to distill what was important and like sort of help carry his message forward, but also not just like simply like repeat what had come before. That sort of like find like if there's a different way to help people connect with it. But the humbling thing is very often just like nobody is a more effective communicator than Fred Rogers. So I'm going to end with just reading a little bit from one of his very last PSAs they ever did after the show ended. Like it was sort of like a goodbye to like his viewers. And he said, "I'm just so proud of all of you who have grown up with us. And I know how tough it is some days to look with hope and confidence on the months and years ahead. But I would like to tell you now what I often told you when you were much younger. I like you just the way you are." Thank you.